They said she smiled when told her people were starving. They said she tilted her head, jeweled and perfumed, and murmured, "Let them eat cake." Those words would echo through France like a guillotine's blade drawn in slow motion. But Marie Antoinette never said them. The truth is quieter, less convenient, and far more dangerous. It reveals how a single lie, wrapped in envy and politics, could set fire to a kingdom already soaked in powder. Paris in the 1760s was restless. The Enlightenment had unchained ideas that could no longer be silenced. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's words, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, moved through cafes and pamphlets like a fever." To the poor, these ideas offered dignity. To the elite, they were poison. And by the time a 15-year-old Austrian princess rode into France to marry the future king, that poison was already in the bloodstream of the nation. Marie Antoinette arrived in 1770, a political offering to unite the House of Habsburg with the Bourbons. She was not yet queen, not yet a villain. She was a teenager, lonely and foreign, surrounded by courtiers who despised her accent and mocked her innocence. Versailles glittered like a cage of mirrors. Behind every reflection, a whisper. Her clothes, her laughter, her mother's letters all became weapons. And though she smiled as custom demanded, the first cracks had already begun. The myth of the cake would not be born until years later. Its roots reach back to Rousseau himself. In his Confessions, written long before Marie Antoinette arrived in France, he describes an unnamed princess who, upon hearing the peasants had no bread, replied, "Let them eat brioche." It was meant as irony, a philosopher's anecdote, not an accusation. But revolutionaries would later give the nameless princess a face, hers. By the 1780s, France was collapsing under the weight of its own indulgence. The treasury was hollow. Crops had failed. Bread, once the poor man's right, became a luxury. Rumors bled faster than facts. Pamphleteers, armed with venom and ink, painted the queen as a foreign serpent who drained France's lifeblood into her gowns and gambling tables. They called her Madame Deficit. They said she conspired with Austria, that she seduced ministers, that she laughed at hunger. It didn't matter that she funded hospitals, that she adopted orphans, that her spending was less than the king's brothers combined. A lie repeated often enough becomes a weapon sharper than truth. Let them eat cake. The phrase appeared in pamphlets years before the storming of the Bastille, its origin forgotten, its purpose clear to make her monstrous. It was propaganda made perfect, simple, cruel, and unforgettable. To the hungry, she became the enemy of bread itself. To philosophers, she was the emblem of tyranny. And to a people taught to fear their rulers, her beauty became a form of blasphemy. Versailles was now a theater where every gesture was a sin. The revolution fed on symbols, and Marie Antoinette was the ripest of them. Her white chemise dress, once an act of defiance against the suffocating etiquette of court, was turned against her. Pamphlets showed her half-naked, embracing lovers or caressing jewels made of France's taxes. They called her the Austrian whore. When she smiled, they called it arrogance. When she wept, they called it deceit. Every rumor was a brick in the scaffold that would one day hold her neck. In truth, she feared what was coming. The queen who had once danced through masked balls now walked sleepless through the halls of Versailles. Letters to her mother show her unease, her attempts to charm the public, to host charities, to play the role expected of her. But history has little mercy for those who arrive too late. The people had already chosen their story, and it was simpler to hate her than to question the men who had bankrupted them. By 1789, when the Bastille fell, Marie Antoinette's name was already poison. Crowds screamed for her before they screamed for the king. And when pamphlets revived Rousseau's old tale claiming she had laughed at famine, it no longer mattered that he had written it decades before she was even born. Truth bowed to rage. The lie of the cake was not an accident. It was engineered, sculpted by propaganda to justify revolution. It turned one woman into a symbol of every injustice in France, and once that symbol was accepted, no fact could undo it. In October 1789, when thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles demanding bread, they chanted not against famine, but against her. They carried blades, muskets, and hunger. The queen who had once been adored for her youth now hid behind palace doors as the crowd tore through her guards. She escaped that night only by chance. The mob found her bed empty, the sheets cold. Years later, as she stood before the tribunal that would sentence her to death, the myth still hung over her. She was no longer a queen, only a widow and mother, dressed in white for her execution. Her children had been taken. Her husband had been guillotined. And yet, when accused once more of saying those words, she did not defend herself. Perhaps she knew that silence was the only dignity left to her. On October 16, 1793, she mounted the scaffold. The crowd that had once cheered her beauty now jeered her fall. When the blade fell, the myth became immortal. What cannot be disputed, however, is that the words that doomed her were never hers. The cake was never offered, the laughter never spoken. Yet that fiction changed history. It gave the revolution its sainted fury. It justified the blood of thousands. And it still shapes how the world remembers her, not as a woman trapped in a collapsing empire, but as a caricature of greed. The power of a lie lies not in its falsehood, but in its usefulness. Rousseau's philosophy had inspired freedom. His fable inspired hatred. Marie Antoinette became the perfect vessel for that hatred, her Austrian birth and jeweled crown blending into a symbol too elegant to resist destroying. When history needs a villain, truth becomes optional. And so the story of a philosopher's irony became the anthem of rebellion. A queen became a monster. A sentence became a revolution. The guillotine took her head, but the myth outlived her by centuries. Even now, the phrase clings to her name like perfume. But the record shows no such words in her letters, her speeches, or her trials. It was the echo of a man's pen, twisted by politics, carried by rage, immortalized by ignorance. In the end, Marie Antoinette did not die for what she said, but for what others wanted her to have said. Her true crime was being remembered wrongly. Would you have believed her, had you been hungry enough?